think the biggest misconception about burnout is that it comes from the number of hours you're working, but the causal factor to burnout is what are you thinking and feeling during those hours? I'm afraid my ambition has just permanently gone offline. When I ask myself, what do I want? The answer is lay on a beach for 3 months, but that's not a career plan.
So why not just quit? That's what I did. I was at jobs I didn't like, I burned out and I quit.
One part of you is saying, fuck this, I want to quit. But then another part of you is saying, hey, grow up. Life is hard. Jobs are hard. Okay? Stop setting your expectations too high. Put your big girl pants on and be an adult.
Hey Pooja, good to see you.
So good to see you. I'm so glad we're doing this.
I thought it was going to be so fun just catching up and also getting catch up over podcast as well. You're a thoughtful executive coach talking about burnout. And I think that's such a topic that's on everybody's mind. And also, you've got, a whole gold-plated career, right? As well, journey to where you are today from Harvard and, BCG to being a coach today. So I think it's an interesting career journey as well. I think it'll be helpful for many people who are thoughtful about their professional careers as well. So Pooja, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so fun to be catching up. Jeremy and I were classmates at Harvard Business School, and we actually did a project together in our senior year. We worked together, the two of us, on a whole report analyzing the daycare industry, analyzing Bright Horizons. So it's we worked together, we were students together. It's so fun to get to catch up now. Like Jeremy said, I'm an executive coach. I work with Ivy League grads and other high achievers. I help them level up their performance where they are, as well as navigate career transitions, and really ultimately help them build careers that feel as good on the inside as they look on the outside. I think some of my clients are experts at building careers that look amazing on the outside. And it's part of just making sure, hey, let's make sure it feels good and sustainable and aligned to your purpose and, powered by flow rather than powered by stress and anxiety while you're actually building that career as well. So that's my passion. That's what I love to do. Before I was a coach, I spent some time working at BCG. I did a research fellowship with Clay Christensen, the kind of famous inventor and theorist of disruption theory. I did some chief of staff and corporate strategy roles, but I've always been an advisor. When we were at HBS, and we were looking at our careers, people talked about advisor, operator, and investor as three different, pathways that people could go down. And it took me some time to own it, for myself. And I can talk about that as I talk about my career journey. But I am an advisor, that's really my lane. That's the kind of work I love. And so looking back, I'm I was always trying to figure out where to put down my advisory roots. And I tried, 7 different places before I found the place that I'm in now. But that's really always been I love to be an expert in something. I love to go deep. I love to learn a lot and then use writing, communication, teaching, coaching to share that expertise with people and really try to help them. So that's what I do.
Amazing, Pooja. So let's go all the way back to the beginning, which is you studied at Harvard for undergrad and Harvard for your MBA, right? But I'm just going to flashback all the way back to you as an undergrad. When you first started as an undergrad, what was your vision for your career? Was it to be, I don't know, super duper great or be X or Y?
Yeah, it's funny because people see Harvard College, Harvard MBA, and so they assume my path has been pretty linear, right? Because you're oh, you went to Harvard, you just went to Harvard again, and you're always kind of doing the same thing. The truth could not be more different than that. I have always wanted to be a writer. When I was 9 years old, so I'm bringing you back even further than that, my parents got me the first 3 Harry Potter books for my birthday. Those were the 3 that had been published, and I read all of them in one day. I was always a huge reader, and then I opened WordPad on my parents' desktop computer that wasn't connected to the internet, and I just started writing, and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote stories, and just I couldn't stop writing. And I was lucky. I have, Asian immigrant parents. I'm an immigrant myself to the US. And I think the stereotypical image of, Indian immigrant parents is math, engineering, science, doctor. I don't have those parents. I actually have very progressive, liberal parents. And so they really nurtured my interest in writing. They signed me up for all kinds of writing classes outside of school. I did the newspaper, I did mock trial. And so when I came to Harvard College, I was I know one thing about myself, and that is I am a writer, right? And that's going to be my career. And I'm just figuring out, am I going to be a journalist? Am I going to be a novelist? What kind of writing am I going to do? But I know for sure I'm a writer. So I worked on the newspaper in Harvard College, and I was like, oh, this industry is dying. Like, I don't think I want to be a journalist. I had a little bit of business sense. Even back then, I could I could intuitively pick up that maybe it wasn't a good place to build my career. So I was like, okay, not journalism. I tried writing fiction. I was like, I don't like this so much. And I stumbled on a screenwriting class, and it just really clicked for me. I was like, I love writing screenplays. It's fun. It's conversational. You can kind of just like get to the point and like tell the action of the story without having to do all this like literary fluff like around it. So I discovered screenwriting my sophomore year, and I just like jumped all in. I took screenwriting classes every year. My thesis was actually 5 episodes of a TV show, like the script for it. And so I was like, I'm going to move to LA. I'm going to be a comedy TV screenwriter. The Office was coming out at this time. 30 Rock was coming out at this time. I used to get together with my friends every Thursday. And like, I just was a huge comedy nerd. I'm still a comedy nerd. But I was like, that's it. I'm going to like be a writer. That's my plan. And I was so lucky, Harvard undergrad, there's a ton of Harvard alum in the entertainment industry, both writers and creatives, as well as business people. And there's this program called Harvardwood. I literally still donate to them. Like every year I'll send them like $100 because they saved me years of pain. And so they take you to it was like between my junior senior year, they took us to LA for a month, and the level of access they gave us was crazy. Literally, we talked to like top writers, producers, executives, managers, people who finance things, lawyers. Like we got an insane view of like what the entertainment industry is, how it works, how a project comes together, what are the entry level roles, how do you chart your career, crazy levels of connections, people being so honest about like what the true ups and downs of like having a career in entertainment. And then we got an internship like after that, all that stuff. And I did that program, and I was like, oh, I can't do this. I've made a huge mistake. That was my first experience with, I had a career hypothesis and it got brutally disproven. And that is an experience I've repeated many times like since then. That I had a strong hypothesis. I went and tested it, thank God, in a safe way, not by like moving to LA like for a year, but just by doing this program. And I realized, it's funny, again, going back to the business sense, it took me a long time to articulate the feelings that I had on that trip. But my feeling, looking back, what I was feeling was there's too much supply and not enough demand. Like every idiot with a laptop, myself included, can call themselves a writer. And there's a limited number of like writers' rooms, right? And I mean, even more so now, like with AI, like need for writers. But I had a sense of like, something's funny here. Like there's too many people vying for too few jobs. Like that felt funny to me. It felt like the correlation between hard work and success didn't seem strong enough because there were just too much oversupply. And I also felt like, hey, these shows need massive audiences to support them, right? Which means, like, what kind of comedy does a mass audience tend to like? It's the comedy that my comedy snob self thinks is like not very sophisticated and not very fun. And I was like, oh, I don't want to like write on that show and that show. I want to do like my cool, like, thing that I'm excited about. But I had a sense of like, oh, that's not what leads to success in this industry. And so it was just I feel very blessed. I had these like funny little intuitions that was just like, I've been on this path since I was a kid, but I actually don't think this is right for me. And I need to just scrap it all and start from scratch. So I came back, and this is where I'm so like thankful that I went to Harvard undergrad. Like all the top firms recruit at Harvard undergrad, and they don't care what you majored in, and they don't care what you were doing for the last 3 years. If you were just like writing a bunch of screenplays and like writing English papers, like they're still willing to interview you, and like give you a job. And so I literally was just like, I want a job in business. That's the plan. And I discovered, like, I had never heard of management consulting. I had not heard of investment banking. Like, I didn't know like what these things were. Like, my parents went to school in India, right? Like, I didn't have the social capital to like know what these things were. And I like discovered all these kids that had been planning to get those jobs from like day one. And I was like, oh my God, what is happening? I'm so scared. And so I like prepped for case interviews and I did all of that. And I remember my first job out of college was the corporate strategy group at Capital One, right? Which I know doesn't have the brand cachet of like a Bain, BCG, McKinsey. And so people are often like, what was that about? Why'd you do that? But the reason I took that role and I absolutely loved it was this was 2012. Capital One had just acquired ING Bank, and ING had all those cafes. And so Capital One was just starting to build out their cafe strategy. And they were like, we have a hypothesis that the way that people are going to interact with their money in person is going to be very different. You can drop these like flagship cafes in a city and give the sense of presence in a city without having to go put like a branch on every corner, which is very, very expensive. And I was very intrigued by like, ooh, I like thinking about how do people interact with things? How do you design a physical experience and a online experience? And how do you change the way people are interacting with money? So I was like, I think that's a really interesting problem. Let me like recruit for this group. It was a small group of all kind of ex-Bain, BCG, McKinsey folks. It was a little mini kind of consulting experience. And I was like, nobody tells you this is a writing job. I was like, this is just a really well paid, like high impact, like very fun, but like writing job because you were like taking in lots of ambiguity, lots of information, figuring out what even is the key question, how do we structure the problem, getting lots of data. And then once you come to the answer, essentially doing an influence campaign across the organization, right? To say like, how do we operationalize our answer across all these different people? And I was like, you guys need to be recruiting out of the English department because this is what I've been doing for a very long time, just in, different mediums. So I was there for about 3 years. And coming out of that, I applied to Harvard Business School because like everyone around me had gone to Harvard Business School. And it was like everyone would apply after 2 years there. And I got in and I was like, oh, this is great. But coming into HBS, I was like, well, obviously I'm going to go to consulting and I'm going to be a career consultant, right? Because I love corporate strategy. I love working with these consultants. I've discovered that this is like a secret writing job that you can find in the world of business. And so I was like, oh, career planning is easy. Like all you have to do is like go be a consultant, like be in consulting forever and you're going to have a great time. And so it's so funny. I'm now obviously an entrepreneur because I run my own coaching practice. And what I told myself at HBS was I was like, the one thing I know for sure about myself is I definitely never want to be an entrepreneur. And so I ignored all the entrepreneurship resources, like anything that was labeled like startups or entrepreneurship. I was like, that's not for me. And I just like filtered it out, which is chose to go, like, how life goes when you get your career hypotheses disproven. And so I went to HBS and I did my summer internship in BCG in the San Francisco office. And I already kind of had an instinct, even in that summer, that I was like, wait, I think I'm getting another hypothesis disproven. I think this thing that I'm like so sure about that I'm like thinking is going to be my 10+ year plan, like might not be the case. And with consulting, I have nothing against consulting. Plenty of my clients are consultants and ex-consultants. I love the people that I worked with. But my realization was a lot of this work is like more and more like long-term transformation type of work and less of the like early stage, to me, more intellectually interesting kind of strategy stuff, right? Because if you're the size of these companies, you like a little 6-week, 4-person strategy project is not growth for this company, right? You need larger, longer, bigger team, like transformation projects that are going to like represent real growth. And so I was kind of like, okay, I'm getting to do the types of like, I like analysis, I like making slides, I like communication, but the topics are not the topics I'm most excited about. So I was like, okay, this feels like not as fun. And of course, people told me this going into it, and I just didn't believe them. But like the partner role is a sales role. It is not a thought leader role, right? You can sneak in some thought leadership in there, like if you want to, but it is fundamentally a sales role. And I was like, oh, I thought I would get to like write books and like opine on topics. And okay, all right, I'm realizing the reality. It's funny, I do a lot of sales now as well, and I actually really love it. I have a lot of thoughts about sales for people that are scared of sales. So that was another hypothesis, shaken by the summer internship for sure. But again, another like I found a safe way to test it, right? Like I did the internship, I got a little sample, and then I was like, ooh, okay, we need to think about this. And so then I had another hypothesis, which is I did this research fellowship with Clay Christensen. We were actually working on a book project together. And so there was a like, okay, we might write this book and I could be a co-author on it. And this could launch like a whatever you do after writing a really high profile book, you like speak and like go to conferences and become like a thought leader on things. And so that we spent a year like working on that project, which was a phenomenal experience to get to work one-on-one with like one of our, best business thinkers, I think that, has ever been around. So much intellectual humility. Like that was actually the thing that impressed me the most with him, because I think you could so easily, be the biggest voice in the room or just the heaviest ego in the room if you have the level of success and stature that, that he had. And instead, I really saw him just unbelievably open to being challenged, unbelievably open to being wrong, like able to drop an idea if he realized it was incorrect, even if it was his baby, just like, oh, got it. totally not correct. Okay, onward we go. And so that was something I like really admired in working with him. So he spent a year working on this book project. And it was one of those things where it's like you work on it for a year for him to realize that, oh, actually, I'm not as excited about writing this book as I thought I was. And I was like, okay, I totally understand. Like, that is what I was here to do, is to help you like explore this project idea. And I was very excited about, getting it over the finish line and writing it. But ultimately he was like, I don't think I want to prioritize this project anymore, which I was like, totally get it. It's your work and your purview, what you want to do. And so I was like, okay, well, I guess I'm going back to BCG. Like, I don't, have any other ideas.
So I gotta jump in here. Wait a moment. So okay, I get it. Like you're like, I love writing. I also used to love writing. I did the poetry side in
Oh, cool.
in high school, in middle school. I also did a school newspaper, everything. And then you go to college and you're like, okay, this is different. The industry is different. You go to business, makes sense. It pays the salary, pays for school. And then you go to say, I'm doing business. You go to consulting. And then you decide to go and follow everybody else, you said, who's doing the MBA, which is one hell of a way to get to an MBA, the best MBA school. And then you meet Professor Clay Christensen, who's, his pet theory is about discovering yourself on one end, how to measure your life, right? That's one book of his. Another book is about disruption and startups and innovation. And then, wait, you go back to BCG. So how does that happen?
I really thought about, okay, like now that this book project is not going to like come, not going to take off, what do I do next? And my honest thought was, I really don't have, I was like, I'm out of ideas. Like BCG was the idea that I had. I don't think like that hypothesis is on very shaky ground, but I don't have any other ideas for what I possibly want to do. And so my thinking at that point was, first off, hey, you've only done 3 months, right? You only did the summer internship. You can give it a year. You can test the hypothesis more strongly, right? Like you thought this could be a great place to be an advisor. So why don't we like give it 12 months before we like, write it off? And then my other honest thought was, I was like, I don't even know what the heck kind of like self-reflection and exploration. I don't even have a process for figuring out like what I would do that's not this. And so I was like, I think I will be better positioned to figure that out after some time at BCG. I'll have some paid time off. I would have made some more connections. I like will be, I'll be better positioned. Maybe I would have learned something about myself by doing like all of these projects. And so the thought was, hey, I'm pretty sure this isn't the final answer. And I'm going to need to like reckon with that and like really do the like reflection and exploration to figure out what we're really doing at some point. But I think I'll be better positioned to do that after a year, at least a year at BCG, because at least I would have like thoroughly tested the BCG hypothesis, gained some experience, and like, have my transition time, have that network, et cetera. So that was the hypothesis, or that was the thinking anyway, like even though it was like a boring like answer for what to do next. And I think it ended up being the right answer, although it took, 2 more like turns before I really figured it out. I wasn't going to figure out that it was coaching like right after.
I know. Okay. So you figure it out after like, you took one bite of the apple at BCG. And then, you took a second large bite of the apple at the BCG. And I empathized because I was at Bain as well as a consultant. So I understand everything, same consulting. And then you went back to Capital One after that, which was your first business job. So what was your thinking behind that? Because now you're thinking, 2 large bites of Capital One as well.
Totally. It's funny. I had a mentor at BCG. When I told him I was considering this Capital One job, he was like, he actually pushed back very strongly about it. He was like, no, you're just going back to like the safe arms of the company that you already know. You're not being brave. You're not, like pushing yourself. Like, why did you do this whole detour just to like end up back at Capital One? He really like poo-pooed my decision. Right. And I remember looking back and being like, I didn't say it to him. I didn't need to, but it was interesting to have someone in such a position of authority tell me so strongly, I think you're making not only the wrong decision, but frankly, like a cowardly decision. Right. And I, in my head was like, no, I know why I'm doing this. Like, I just think your assessment of the situation is wrong. And I understand why from the outside, you might think, oh, you're just retreating back into something and like, why are you doing this whole circle? But I was like, I know exactly what I'm doing. I know the exact hypothesis that I'm testing. And like, I don't really care what your opinion is because like, I just think it's wrong. And so the hypothesis that I had at the time, so coming out of BCG, I was like, I know for sure I like this advisory thing. And that's very terrifying because like, where the hell are you supposed to do it if not in consulting? Like, what other options in the business world, right? Like, do I join a boutique consulting firm? Like, that didn't really seem like the answer either. So I had my brain like aimed at the question of like, how do I do advisory work in the corporate world, right? Or like, or essentially like that makes money, right? Because I was like, I'm not gonna like get a PhD and go into academia. Like, I'm pretty sure I want to stay in this world. And so the leader that I worked with, I was the chief of staff to the head of credit card fraud, the second time that I was at Capital One. And my hypothesis there, and she had been a mentor of mine for many years. And my hypothesis was, I think fraud could be a place where I put down my advisory roots. It's very fast moving. It's very technically complicated. There's a strong like cat and mouse element to fraud because you come up with things to like block the fraudsters and the fraudsters come up with like more things to like get around with what you came up with. And so I was like, it's fast moving, it's technically complicated. It has a lot of implications on the business, but business people don't have time to get smart about it. And so I was like, okay, this could be my specialty. This could be the place where I am like the thought leader and the advisor that I want to be. It could be in the space of fraud, right? And how lucky am I that like my mentor is the executive and she's willing to just like, let me sit on her shoulder as her chief of staff and like figure this out, right? Like for a year or two. So I didn't bother like telling the mentor all that. I was like, okay, I hear you. Like, I get it. But for me, it was very much a like, I have thoughtfully considered like what I'm really trying to do and like the space I'm trying to find in the world. And this is not a step backwards or like retreat. This is the next hypothesis like that I'm testing. And so I spent, I want to say a couple years there. COVID also happened, I think like 3 months after I started that job, like COVID started, which had a ton of impact on that business as well. But it was my next disproven hypothesis. And the realization there was advisory is great, but advisory does not move the needle in fraud. What moves the needle in fraud is operations. Like fraud is all about like on the front end, like updating a lot of technical models. And then on the back end, once fraud occurs, like how do you make your processes for like dealing with and like reconciling and closing out fraud cases like as efficient as possible, right? It's an incredible, and at the time, certainly it was like a very like manual, like slow moving process. But as I was spent time in the role, I was like, this is about managing the P&L of fraud and like reducing the operational cost, preventing fraud upfront, updating tech models, all of which is amazing, right? Like these are great things to do. But I was like, this is an operational role. Like this is in no way, like you can like advise on things if you want to, but that's not what adds value in this role. Like what this role needs is like a strong operator, a strong leader, and someone who is good at and excited about navigating a large corporation in order to get shit done, right? Like that is really who shines in this role. And I think I was really lucky that I had colleagues who were about my age, who are like peer, like, same level as mine. And I got to watch them work and I was like, oh, you love this. You love making things happen in a large organization through lots of different people. You love solving the puzzle of like, what's really going on in this complex organization? Where do I find the right data? How do I diagnose the root cause? Then how do I operationalize the solution? And so I was lucky that like, I think it's easy sometimes for people to fall into the trap, especially sometimes high achievers, of like, hey, grow up. Life is hard. Jobs are hard. Okay, stop setting your expectations too high, put your big girl pants on and like be an adult, right? It's easy to just think there's a ceiling on how good work can feel. And at some point you just have to like grow up and, and fulfill your responsibilities. But I was lucky to see people that were loving and thriving in that job. And so I didn't have that sense of like, oh, everybody hates this, but like that's life, is you just don't like your job that much and you move on and that's how you live. And so it gave me the sense of like, no, I also deserve to feel this way, right? I also deserve to like play to my superpowers and lean into my strength to do the kind of work I want to do. And like these people have found it, but I need to like find it for myself. And so I think I was lucky to like, to see that piece. And so then I made my final transition into what I believe to be my forever career, which is being a coach. So I can talk more about how that happened if you want, but I can also pause because I feel like I've been talking for a long time.
So, I think this is quite interesting because I think that you tend to have a hypothesis for your career, right? And so you're very much like, I have a hypothesis is writing. Okay, it doesn't really, pay the bills. It's very competitive. I'm going to do business. Okay, it pays the bills. And then I think I think I can hear that very clear hypothesis approach. On one end, I think it feels like every angle is very clear hypothesis. On the other hand, obviously, from a logo perspective, it looks circular, right? It almost looks like a Japanese, Zen circle, right? Where you're like, it's like Harvard to Capital One to BCG to Harvard to BCG.
That's actually so true.
To Capital One,
That's
right?
so funny.
So it looks like a giant, circle there. So, so I'm just kind of curious how what's your reflection on this set of corporate moves before we talk about executive coaching side? Like, was there
Yeah.
faster ways to approach that discovery process? Was there a more intuitive approach? Were there other logos or industries? I'm just kind of curious how you think about it.
Yeah, it's funny. It is. It's true, right? Like, I've never thought about that, but it can look circular from the outside. I actually think my takeaway is more that, like, and I talk to my clients about this too, is like what you're seeing on the outside, whether you're assessing potential career paths for yourself or whether you're like doom scrolling on LinkedIn and like looking at everyone else's updates and being like, oh, they're doing this and like they're doing this and like what am I doing? Is just to be like, all you're seeing is the wrapping paper on the outside of the box, right? And that tells only a fraction of the story. And your brain is going to want to construct a narrative, right? It's going to want to make it mean, oh, this person, they just got promoted to like MD at this place. This person just raised $500 million, right? And you see all these little flashes, right, of the wrapping paper. And your brain will be like, what this means is, oh, like they're so on top of it. They've got it all figured out. They're just on the rocket ship to success, right? Or you might look at my little glints of wrapping paper and be like, oh, what's happening there? She just did a little like figure eight, like loop. Like, what was the point of that, right? But the truth is, when you like take the wrapping paper off and you actually open the box and look at what's going on inside, there couldn't have been more different experiences than Harvard College and Harvard Business School, than my first time at Capital One to my second time at Capital One. And not only different in like experiences like inside the box, but also different motivations, right? Of like, why did I choose this? What was I trying to do? What was I trying to figure out? I don't know if there was I actually really don't think there was a faster way, because it's like I needed the information, right? Like I had to do the thing to get the information, and that's what informed like the next thing that I was doing. There's no career assessment, no psychotherapist, no tarot card reader, like nobody could have told me what experience like ultimately had to tell me. But I think that's the biggest one, is like it's so tempting, especially as like all high achievers are a little brand conscious and a little like status conscious. And it's so easy to like look at those like shiny pieces of paper and say like, oh, this is what their story really is. This is what it means. And I'm always telling people like life is lived like 99% is like the inside of the box, right? But even if you go to Harvard or work at McKinsey or work at Bain, you spend very little time telling people that that's what you do. And you spend all your time actually like going to class or doing the job or like doing whatever it is. And so that like inside the box, like under the hood, is really both creates the experience and is actually like what's driving, like the narrative of what's going on.
So let's talk about that, because obviously if people had tarot cards and one of them, the cards was Harvard, and one of the cards was BCG, and other card was Capital One, I think that would be pretty funny actually. But you wrap this, from the outside, Zen circle, but obviously from your perspective, very clear hypotheses on, your role, your experience, your workplace, the verticals within those organizations. And then you decide to become an executive coach, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting, right? Because a lot of people at this point probably go for executive coaching. I mean, many professionals and peers of mine have executive coaches. But it's one thing to go for executive coaching and another thing to become an executive coach, right? So I'm just kind of curious how you approach that career choice and transition.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny, like, when you were saying, hey, it was so like clear and hypothesis driven, like the journey that you had, it's one of those where the dots connect looking backwards, right? Like looking backward, it's very easy to say, this is what I was trying to figure out. And then this is the decision I made, et cetera. But I think as you are living your life forward, the truth, I think for people in like career transitions and just any moment where you're really trying to figure out what's next, and like, you're like, something about the path I'm not is not working. Something needs adjustment, but I don't know exactly what it is. I would say it's like in my work with my clients and for myself too, it's like 20% strategic problem solving and like, hypothesis testing and all that stuff. And I would say it's like 80%, call it like keeping your brain calm. And not freaking out, right? And not making decisions or trying to do analysis from like a fear-based brain. And so I hired coaches. Initially, I had no intention of being a coach, but I was like, I am completely out of ideas, like for my career. I have tried every single thing I could think of. I have disproven yet another hypothesis, and it's COVID, so I'm like trapped in my house, not seeing anyone, working 24/7, and like in a little bit of an existential like doom loop. And I'm a big stress eater. And so I was like, I'm eating everything in the house. Like something needs to change. Can't clothes anymore. So like, and so I hired a coach, to be like, what is like, what do I have? What am I doing? Right. And at that point I was like, am I just like, right. Am I just crazy? Right. Like I have a great job with a great boss and great benefits and a promotion pathway and like a job that a lot of people would be very happy to have. Right. And like, should I just like get myself excited about it? Right? Like what's my problem? And so I worked with coaches initially just purely with the intention of like, help me untangle this problem in my own mind because my career is tremendously important to me. I'm not ready or willing to be like, life sucks, work sucks, just suck it up and do it. I was like, I can't do that. I'm still very ambitious. I still have very high expectations for like what my career is going to look like and what success looks like for me, but I can't figure out how to achieve it. And so as I worked with these coaches, they just used a really, really simple, clear, clean problem solving framework to help me break down the problems. And it's the framework I use now with my clients, which I'm happy to talk more about in detail. But like my takeaway was basically, oh, this is a clear, clean, simple way to break down any problem, a life problem, a work problem, an emotional problem, whatever it is. Whenever you find yourself stuck, confused, and not sure what to do next, or frustrated because you're like, I don't feel the way I want to feel, I'm not doing what I want to be doing, I don't have the outcomes I want to have, like here's a way to just like take the squishy, emotional, like soft feeling stuff of all of that and break it down, categorize it, put it into a MECE framework, find the root cause, and then like build a solution. And so I was just so struck by the power of the problem solving that I was like, oh, like one, this is great. Two, I've been to some of the best institutions and schools in the world. This is dead simple stuff. Nobody taught me this. Like, are you kidding me? Like this, why was this not like taught to me like right away? Because it's so powerful and so simple once I know it. And then my next thought was, well, of course, like I was like, I want an advisory career. I've been looking for the place I can put my roots down. This could be a good place. But I was also like, when I think about all of my friends, right, all of my Harvard consulting, banking, finance, tech, like all like high stress, high achieving friends, right? I was like, first off, all of them have accomplished incredible things. None of them are like, 100% happy, right? Everyone is like stressed and striving and like the feeling like something's not quite right. And there's a lot of modalities, right? People go to therapists and they have a personal trainer and they have Headspace on their phone and they do a ayahuasca retreat, like you do, people have all these different things that they do to make themselves feel better and gain clarity and all of those things. And I was like, and I think there's white space in the market for this framework and for this style of coaching. I was like, I think it is different from everything else. I think it is appealing to like an analytical, consulting, IV type of thinker. I think people appreciate like being able to bring rigor to something that feels like softer or like squishier. And so that was my hypothesis. I was like, I love it. I think all my friends are going to love it. And no one else is doing it in this space. And so like, let's go. I see the business case. And so that's how I got started.
Wait, so let's talk about white space. I mean, maybe less from a theoretical perspective, but what exactly is that coaching that is different? Because, like you said, people have personal trainers, people have Headspace. What do you call it? Career coaching, executive coaching? How do you think about it as a practice?
Yeah, totally. So I think like executive coaching or career coaching, I use those terms kind of interchangeably. Sometimes I just say I'm a coach. I think the place it fits in is, I would say there's some career coaching which is highly tactical, right? Which is like resume review, interview prep, that kind of thing. So that's one space. That's not what I do, right? I'm happy to do, interview prep and things with people, but that's not I'm not like a tactical, coach primarily. And then I would say on the other end of the spectrum, there's essentially like therapy, right? Which will be much more, and every therapist is different, and I'm definitely a fan of therapy, but therapy tends to be more backwards looking, right? To say like, where did this start? Where did these patterns begin? Like where in your childhood? And then of course, if you have a feeling that you may have mental illness or a disorder of any kind, therapy is what can diagnose you, right? Like a coach comes in with the assumption your brain is healthy and nothing's wrong with you. And now let's just like solve normal problems that normal brains have. So there's the like therapy, which is like backwards looking and more of like, let's identify where the pattern started. There's tactical career coaching, which is forward looking, but like quite tactical. And then the place I would put myself with like career or executive coaching is really like the intersection between those two, where we are absolutely focused on tangible outcomes, right? Whether that is, I want to get clear on what I'm doing next. I want to navigate the transition to that role. I want to get promoted. I want to improve my performance. Also, even just like, I want to like be able to unplug at the end of the day and like be fully present with my kids without like feeling like I'm thinking about work the whole time, right? Like those are very clear, tangible outcomes as well. So we're always keeping our eye on like what's the goal that we're trying to achieve, and like we're not done until it's been achieved, right? There's like rigor from that
Mhm.
sense. But as we're looking to achieve those goals, what I'm doing is backing it up to say, I'm not going to be tactical. I'm going to say, what are you thinking and feeling that is blocking you from doing what you want to do? Right? Let's go upstream, like 2 steps, and just understand what is your automatic brain doing? What are the assumptions, mental models, fears, concerns, blockers that you have that are preventing you from operating the way you want to operate, or getting clear on what you want to do next, or just going towards the thing that you want, but are also kind of scared of? Let's kind of problem solve at that kind of like thoughts and feelings level. And once we crack those, the actions and the results just waterfall right out of that.
So I'm curious, which is that, you know, you've been also writing a lot of posts, and I think one post that jumped out at me was also, I think you talking about burnout, right, for
Yeah.
professionals, and I think that's an interesting angle because, you know, I think that if people need to have their resume, those are resume coaches, or you can use AI these days, and then obviously if people want to think about, you know, general career advice, they can find it on blogs and stuff. But I think burnout is somewhere of the intersection of those two things, right? Like let's call it the therapy is crisis mode, but also the executive
Yeah.
piece in a career setting, right? So could you talk a little bit about what burnout means and what your thoughts are and how you've seen it play out in your coaching practice?
I think the biggest misconception about burnout is that it comes from like the number of hours you're working, or like how hard you're working, how demanding the work is, how high pressure it is, right? People think, well, if you're working 24/7, you're up until 2 in the morning, oh my gosh, you must be burning out. And if, have 2 hours of work a day and you're like, you're barely doing anything, well, oh my gosh, what a luxurious life, right? And what I find is burnout can be correlated with the number of hours you're working, certainly. But the causal factor to burnout is what are you thinking and feeling during those hours? Because my project at BCG, where I worked the absolute most, we literally worked till 2 or 3 in the morning, Monday to Thursday. And I would regularly, like, my slides would be done. I would like stay late to like make other people's slides, right? It was just like such a team effort. It's crazy hours, like that project. Most fun time of my life. Like, genuinely still look back fondly. Like, at that time, I was like, oh, what a dream. Like, that was so much fun, right?
BCG is
They're
like,
still in
great,
touch.
we can bring her back. Anyway.
Exactly. Right. And I can also think of times in my career where I've had very little to do, right? Like not that much work on, and I have felt tremendously burnt out because what I was thinking and feeling while I was sitting there was like, what am I doing? Why am I here? What should I be doing? Well, should I do this? Well, I don't know if that makes any sense. And so I always bring people back to like the cause of your burnout is going to be what is the mental and emotional soundtrack that's running inside you all day long. And I think there's a couple flavors of it that tend to cause burnout. Because if that soundtrack runs for like an hour or two, right, and it's very stressful, but then you're fine the rest of the time, it's not going to be a big deal. It's when it runs 24/7 for months and years at a time, right, that's when it really causes burnout. So I'd say one flavor of that soundtrack is the essentially I'm not doing a good job. Right? You can call that imposter syndrome. You could call that like just being in a stretch zone, right? And like being promoted and then like truly like doing things you haven't done before. But anytime people are feeling like I'm doing a bad job, people are judging me, I'm going to get found out, like, that I actually don't really know what I'm doing. I'm like, every meeting feels so high stakes. I always feel behind on my to-do list, right? Any of those things which essentially sum up to, I feel like I'm not doing a good job. For high achievers, that is like an existential threat, right? To feel like you're just like, like I'm bad at this. Like the feelings associated with that are so fearful and so intense that to feel that way, like for a long period of time will absolutely cause burnout. And that's almost kind of like a high intensity, right? Like burnout's like a high intensity emotion. The other one, which can be a little more subtle and doesn't come with that high intensity emotion, is a sense of like, I'm not on the path I want to be on. I'm not doing a bad job. No one's yelling at me. Often there's a lot of things about the job where it's like on paper, it looks great. People would think I was crazy if I stopped doing this. But there's just a voice inside that's like, this is not it. This is not what I want to be doing for whatever reason, right? Maybe it's because there's something else you want to do. Maybe it's something you're not interested in, whatever it is. And it's surprising because that's not like that high, what people picture when they imagine burnout is that high intensity, I'm working all the time, high pressure thing. I have seen the second one creates the same kind of burnout, right? It's just every day you feel that friction. You're like, okay, I have to like respond to the meetings and go like emails and go to the meetings and do this. But all the time there's this unanswered question of like, I don't want to be here. I want to do this. Like, what are we doing? Why? And you don't have a satisfactory answer to it. And that is the like second flavor that I see also leads to burnout for people.
So why not just quit? I mean, if I was a coach, I'm just saying, and people, like they tell me this, that burned out, etc. And then, I'm not an executive coach. I'm not trained to be an executive coach. I'm more of a, you know, operator. I think that's one. I like investing. I hang out. So I always caveat, and I always tell people, hey, why not just quit, right? Because that's what I've been in. I was at jobs I didn't like. I burned out, and I quit, right? So, 5-minute call. I didn't charge you anything. It's like, bam. Okay. So what's the difference? Why not just quit, for example?
Totally. And it's funny, I will ask people similar questions, not because I'm trying to tell them you should actually quit, but because it can actually be helpful to like give someone an answer for the purpose of seeing how do they react to that answer, right? Because the reason people need coaching is if 100% of them was convinced the right answer is to quit, they'll just quit. No, there's nothing to be worked through. They're just like, okay, well, I quit. I knew that. There's no part of me that was against that decision, right? Where people end up needing coaching or just like a thought partner to think things through is when there's a tug of war internally, right? When one part of you is saying, fuck this, I want to quit. But then another part of you is saying, but all my friends would think I was stupid, or my parents would be really mad at me, or I don't know what else I want to do. And often with burnout, it's like, I don't know what else I want to do. I'm afraid my ambition has just permanently gone offline. When I ask myself, what do I want? The answer is lay on a beach for 3 months, but like, that's not a career plan, right? And like, I need to like make money, like all of those things. And so that's really where I think coaching can come in is like people feel this conflict between two sides of themselves or even multiple sides of themselves. And that's what stops people, right? If like, because if there's no conflict, my clients are extremely like high achieving and proactive and like, action oriented. They're gone, right? Like they've already moved on to the next thing. They don't need me whatsoever. But it's that conflict that I think people just struggle with because especially when our careers are so important to us, right? Like, and like achievement, status, success, ambition, like all of those things are so important to us. And when the stakes are so high, one of my favorite coaches had this great quote where she said, when emotion is high, intelligence is low. And like when the stakes are really high, when it's your baby and your career and your life and your LinkedIn page and your, little announcement to everyone at the 10-year reunion, this is what I'm up to, guys, right? Your emotions are going to be high. It's inevitable. Right? Like unless you're literally like a stone cold serial killer, you're gonna have a higher level of like attachment and emotional engagement when it's your own career. And then inevitably, because your emotions are high, your intelligence is gonna be lower, right? Your best thinking faculties are not gonna be offline. That's why it's so easy to give advice to other people and then you come back to your own life and you're like, damn, I should take my own advice, right? Why is that so easy to solve that person's problem? Because you're not attached to it. And so that's where I think coaching can really come in is to both help people. One, my brain is like not emotionally engaged, right? So my intelligence is online. I can offer my perspective, but also helping people learn how do I calm my brain down in the moments when it is really high stakes and my brain does want to be in a lot of fear or just feel the pressure of the situation. How do I calm myself back down? How do I access my higher level thinking? And then once people can do that, and then they just have some space, right? To say like, okay, one side of the argument, second side of the argument, third side of the argument, here, how do we like just, solve the puzzle of all these pieces? That's where then it gets much easier for people to like feel clear about what to do and, go confidently.
Yeah. And on that note, could you share a personal story about a time that you've been brave?
Yeah, I look back to like the version of me that like decided it was like I didn't even decide that I want to be a coach. I hadn't figured out what I wanted to do, but the version of me that decided to leave the chief of staff job and was like, it's not going to be this, it's going to be TBD other thing. Right? That was probably the scariest moment because like I didn't have a name for it. I didn't have a plan. Like it was a moment of like maximum belief with minimum evidence and minimum plan. Minimum anything, right? And that I look back at that time and I'm like, how did I do that? I mean, but I really somehow there was something in me that was like, I know what my strengths are. I know what my superpowers are. I know what it feels like to apply them and like be applying them in the right angle, right? Where you're like, oh, this is creating a lot of value. Like this is aimed at the right problem. It's positioned in the right way. And you just like see, I did a podcast episode about this recently, like the handshake between your superpowers and somebody else's high priority problem. Like I had experienced that handshake before and I knew I wasn't experiencing the handshake right then. And just kind of being like, damn it, I think my superpowers are valuable. I think the thing inside me is good and worth betting on and worth investing in. And I don't know anything other than that. Right? I know that. And then I know a lot of skeptical voices from the outside that are like, what the hell are you doing? But I'm going to like bet on like me and the thing inside me that I think can be really good and be angled into something that's really valuable. I'm going to bet on that. in the absence of any evidence or any plan, even though many people would think I was nuts. So I think that was one of my braver moments.
Oh boy. And if you could flash back to all the way, travel back in time to your, let's say, graduating self, right? What advice would you give to yourself over coffee?
MBA graduation or college
No,
graduation?
definitely college undergrad.
College undergrad.
Yeah.
Ooh, interesting. It's a good question. I'm trying to think. Honestly, I wouldn't tell her anything. But I don't know if that's a cop out answer, but like partly I'm like, there was so much she had to discover, like for herself. And so even if I told her one day you're going to be a coach, right? Like it just like it wouldn't have made sense. Like it would have been impossible to like take it in. Or maybe I just tell her like buy these stocks. Honestly, that might be it's like advice. But no, I think like I don't know when I look back at previous versions of me and I feel so like the way that you feel when you're looking at like a kid, you know what I
Mhm.
mean? And you're just like, oh my gosh, like you don't even know. You don't even know what you're in for. You don't even know what you don't know. You're not even aware of your own naivete. Like you're this precious little butterfly that has no idea that you're like in the middle of a storm. And oh my God, like, and so I don't even think I think all I would tell her is like, you've got something good in you. Like keep following the thread. Like there's something in you that tells you what's good, what doesn't work, like warmer, colder. This is the direction I'm supposed to go. You can trust that voice. Like keep trusting it. And it's going to take you to good places.
On that note, thank you so much for sharing. I'd like to summarize the three big takeaways. First, thanks for sharing about your early career journey. I thought that, again, from the outside in, kind of like check off all the boxes, right? Capital One, strategy, Boston Consulting Group, management consulting, Harvard, twice. But I think it was interesting to hear about, I think, your thought process at each stage and some of the dilemmas and trade-offs that you felt that you had to make. So that was really interesting. Secondly, thanks for sharing about your approach to career and executive life. I thought it was interesting to hear the methodology and frameworks that you were thinking about to make those decisions and how you applied them both to your own life, but also as an executive coach as well. Lastly, thanks so much for sharing about burnout. I think that's something that's many working professionals feel um, or feel that they're going to experience soon, depending on their percentage, overwhelmed nature they feel. And I thought it was interesting to hear about how you broke it out between uh, whether it's because they are truly burned out from feeling unhappy at work fundamentally, or whether it's a different angle, which is that they don't feel like they're on track to the life that they want to have. So I thought that was really helpful as a distinction. On that note, thank you so much for sharing your experience, Pooja.
Of course. So happy to do it.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.